Picture a man whose name alone struck terror across the battlefield, a ruler so brutal, his enemies whispered it in the dark, as if saying it too loudly might summon his wrath. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, but history remembers him by a far more gruesome title, Vlad the Impaler. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a warning. Stories of his cruelty spread like wildfire, tales of forests made not of trees, but of writhing bodies left to rot on towering spikes. But behind the legend lies a far more complex figure, a man who defied empires, reshaped nations, and left a legacy so dark it inspired one of literature's most infamous monsters. What drove a prince to such extremes? Was he a bloodthirsty tyrant or a cunning strategist fighting for survival in an era where mercy meant weakness? His life reads like a tapestry woven with threads of war, betrayal, and psychological warfare so ruthless it still chills us today. Imagine being a soldier on the battlefield, staring at an army of the dead, not slain in combat but displayed like macabre trophies, a message carved in flesh and bone. This was Vlad's world, where fear wasn't just a tool, it was the foundation of his rule. Yet, even as we shudder at his methods, questions linger. How did a boy taken hostage by the Ottoman Empire become one of its most feared adversaries? What secrets lay buried in the letters he wrote or the battles he fought? And why, centuries later, does his shadow still loom so large, not just in history books, but in our collective imagination? This is the enigma of Vlad the Impaler, a story of power, vengeance, and the thin line between monster and monarch. Strap in, because we're about to peel back the layers of myth and uncover the man behind the legend. One thing's certain, by the end, you'll never look at history or horror the same way again. Vlad the Impaler didn't emerge from thin air. His ruthless nature was forged in the fires of his upbringing, a childhood steeped in violence, betrayal, and the cutthroat politics of medieval Wallachia. Born in 1428 in the fortress of Siasora, Transylvania, Vlad III entered a world where power shifted like quicksand. His father, Vlad II, was no stranger to brutality himself. A member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order dedicated to defending Christianity against the Ottoman Empire, he earned the nickname Dracula, meaning the dragon. But in Romanian folklore, it also carried a darker connotation, the devil. And so, young Vlad became Dracula, the son of the dragon, a name that would one day echo through history with far more sinister weight. But titles meant little without stability, and Wallachia was anything but stable. Caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north, the region was a battleground of allegiances. Vlad II played a dangerous game, swearing fealty to the Ottomans to secure his throne only to betray them when it suited him. This precarious balancing act came at a cost. When Vlad was just 12 years old, he and his younger brother Radu were handed over as hostages to the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II, as collateral for their father's loyalty. Life in the Ottoman court was a double-edged sword. On one hand, Vlad received an elite education, studying warfare, philosophy, and the art of governance. On the other, he was a prisoner in all but name, a constant reminder of his father's precarious loyalty. The psychological toll was immense. Humiliation, isolation, and the ever-present threat of execution hung over him, a stark lesson in the price of weakness. Meanwhile, his brother Radu thrived, embracing Ottoman culture and even earning the favor of the Sultan's heir, Mehmed II. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Radu, charming and adaptable, while Vlad simmered with resentment, his pride festering into something far darker. Then came the news that would shatter any remaining innocence. In 1447, Vlad II was betrayed and murdered by rival noblemen, his head paraded as a trophy. Wallachia descended into chaos, and the young prince, now free but orphaned, had a choice: submit or fight. The boy who returned from captivity was not the same one who had left. He had learned the Ottomans' tactics, their ruthlessness, and their mastery of psychological warfare, and he would use every lesson against them. This was the crucible that forged the Impaler. A childhood of betrayal, a youth spent in the lion's den, and a burning desire to reclaim his birthright no matter the cost. The stakes weren't just power, they were survival. And in Vlad's world, survival meant making sure your enemies feared you more than death itself. Vlad's return to Wallachia in 1448 wasn't a triumphant homecoming, it was a desperate gamble. At just 17 years old, he seized the throne with Ottoman support, but his reign lasted mere months. The Hungarian regent John Hunyadi, a formidable opponent who saw Vlad as an Ottoman puppet, swiftly drove him into exile. This was the first brutal lesson in the fleeting nature of power. For the next 8 years, Vlad wandered through Moldavia and Hungary, a prince without a kingdom, sharpening his resolve and studying the art of war. He watched as Wallachia's throne changed hands repeatedly, each ruler more corrupt than the last, the boyars, the wealthy noble class playing kingmaker to serve their own interests. These nobles weren't just political opponents, they were the architects of his father's murder, and Vlad never forgot it. His chance for vengeance came in 1456, when Hunyadi, now recognizing Vlad's hatred for the Ottomans, backed his bid for the throne. This time, Vlad entered Wallachia not as a pawn but as a storm. His first act, a brutal purge of the boyars. Legend says he invited them to a banquet, a feast of reconciliation, only to have his soldiers impale the elders on the spot and force the survivors into a death march through the Carpathian Mountains. Whether entirely true or not, the message was clear. This ruler wouldn't be manipulated. Vlad understood that in a land where loyalty was bought and sold, fear was the only currency that mattered. But his ruthlessness wasn't mindless cruelty, it was calculated strategy. The boyars had bled Wallachia dry, hoarding wealth while peasants starved. Vlad stripped them of their lands, redistributed their wealth, and enforced harsh punishments for corruption. He didn't just want power, he wanted control. His methods were grotesque, yes, but effective. Crime rates plummeted. Foreign merchants reported leaving bags of gold unattended in the streets for days, untouched. For the common people, Vlad's reign brought a perverse kind of stability, a trade-off between terror and order, yet his greatest test was yet to come. The Ottomans, once his reluctant allies, now saw him as a rogue threat. Sultan Mehmed II, Vlad's childhood companion turned ruler of a vast empire, demanded tribute, gold and young boys for his army. Vlad refused, not just refused, but impaled the Sultan's envoys, their turbans nailed to their heads as a final insult. This wasn't merely rebellion, it was a declaration of war. And in that moment, Vlad the Impaler stepped onto history's stage, ready to carve his legacy in blood and defiance. The stage was set for a showdown that would echo through the centuries, one man against an empire, with Wallachia's survival hanging in the balance. The tension between Vlad the Impaler and the Ottoman Empire wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. After years as a hostage in their courts, he understood their strategies, their weaknesses, and above all, their pride. When he refused to pay tribute to Sultan Mehmed II, it wasn't just a rejection of Ottoman authority, it was a calculated act of humiliation. The Sultan, who had once been his childhood companion, now saw Vlad as a traitor who needed to be crushed. But Vlad had no intention of bowing. Instead, he prepared for war with a chilling precision, turning Wallachia's landscape into a nightmare for any invading force. The Ottomans expected a conventional battle. What they got was something far more terrifying. Vlad's forces avoided open confrontation, vanishing into the forests and mountains only to reappear like ghosts, striking supply lines, poisoning wells, and leaving behind fields of impaled prisoners as grim warnings. His masterpiece of psychological warfare came in 1462, when Mehmed's massive army marched toward Târgoviște, the Wallachian capital. As they approached, the Sultan's troops were met with an unimaginable sight: a forest of 20,000 stakes, each bearing the corpse of an Ottoman soldier or ally. The air was thick with the stench of decay, vultures circling overhead. Maimed, a conqueror who had faced armies across continents, reportedly turned his men away, shaken by the sheer horror of it. But Vlad's most audacious move was yet to come: the night attack. Knowing his forces were outnumbered, he launched a daring raid on the Ottoman camp, disguised as a Turkish soldier to slip past sentries. His target maimed himself. In the chaos that followed, thousands of Ottomans were killed, though the Sultan narrowly escaped. The attack became legendary, not just for its boldness, but for its sheer psychological impact. For the first time, the mighty Ottoman war machine had been humbled not by numbers, but by sheer, unrestrained terror. Yet defiance came at a cost. The Ottomans regrouped, pushing Vlad's forces to the brink. His own brother, Radu, now led an Ottoman-backed faction, exploiting Wallachian fatigue with Vlad's brutal rule. Cornered, Vlad fled to Hungary, where he was imprisoned by his former ally, King Matthias. But even in chains, his legend grew. The Ottomans spread stories of his savagery, painting him as a monster, partly to justify their own campaigns, partly because the truth was too unsettling to ignore. Because Vlad the Impaler wasn't just a king or a warrior. He was a man who understood that in a world of empires, sometimes the only way to survive was to become something even they feared. His war with the Ottomans wasn't just about territory. It was about revenge, identity, and the brutal calculus of power. And though he would regain his throne one final time, his methods had already etched his name into history, not just as a ruler, but as a warning of what happens when resistance strips away all restraint. Impalement wasn't just a method of execution for Vlad the Impaler. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The act itself was horrifyingly deliberate. Victims were forced onto sharpened wooden stakes, often inserted through the rectum or torso, then raised vertically so gravity would slowly drag them downward. Death could take hours, even days, as the body's weight caused the stake to pierce deeper without hitting vital organs immediately. But the true brutality lay in the spectacle. Vlad didn't hide these executions in dungeons. He displayed them in sprawling forests of the dead, lining roads and encircling cities, turning the landscape itself into a theater of terror. Where did such a grisly tactic originate? Historical records suggest Vlad adopted it from Ottoman and Balkan traditions, where impalement was occasionally used to punish rebels or traitors. But Vlad elevated it to an art form. His version wasn't just about killing, it was about sending an unmistakable message. When Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans in his court, he had them nailed to their heads before impalement. When Saxon merchants betrayed trade agreements, their corpses dangled above the markets they once exploited. Each act was tailored to humiliate, to unnerve, to ensure no one doubted the consequences of defiance. Yet the line between history and legend blurs. Later chronicles, like the German pamphlets of the 15th century, exaggerated the numbers, claiming tens of thousands impaled in a single campaign, while overlooking Vlad's strategic motives. Yes, he used terror, but often with chilling precision. Before battles, he'd impale prisoners in view of enemy troops, shattering their morale. After victories, he'd leave warning forests to deter future invasions. Even his own people weren't spared. Thieves and corrupt officials met the same fate, creating a perverse sense of order amid the brutality. The psychological impact was undeniable. Survivors described the scent of decay carried for miles, the sight of birds feasting on still living victims. Ottoman chroniclers wrote of soldiers vomiting at the sight, their seasoned commanders struggling to maintain discipline. But perhaps most telling was Vlad's nickname, coined not by his enemies but by his own people, Tepes the Impaler. It wasn't just a title, it was a brand, a symbol of power so absolute, so terrifying that it transcended language. Modern scholars debate whether the scale of his cruelty was amplified by propaganda. Saxon merchants who clashed with Vlad over trade disputes had motive to paint him as a monster. But even stripped of exaggeration, the core truth remains: Vlad weaponized horror in ways few rulers dared. His impalements weren't just punishments, they were performances, each stake a macabre monolith reminding the world that in Wallachia, defiance was met not with mere death, but with a spectacle so grotesque it haunted the living long after the dying finally fell silent. Vlad the Impaler didn't just rule through brute force, he weaponized fear with a strategist's precision, turning terror into an essential pillar of his governance. His signature tactic, impalement, wasn't chosen at random. It was a meticulously crafted spectacle designed to paralyze enemies and subjects alike with dread. Imagine being a merchant traveling through Wallachia and stumbling upon a grove of corpses lining the roadside, their bodies slowly sinking onto stakes as crows circled overhead. This wasn't merely punishment, it was theater. Every rotting corpse served as a billboard proclaiming the consequences of disloyalty, a visual manifesto of Vlad's absolute control. Contemporary accounts reveal how shockingly effective this was. Ottoman chroniclers wrote of soldiers, hardened veterans who'd faced death in countless battles, breaking ranks at the sight of Vlad's forests of the dead, their discipline unraveling in the face of such calculated horror. Diplomats from rival states like Transylvania and Hungary sent frantic letters home, warning their rulers to avoid provoking Wallachia at all costs. Even Vlad's own people, though spared the worst of his wrath if they obeyed, lived in a state of grim compliance. Crime rates reportedly plummeted to near zero during his reign, not out of respect for justice, but because the penalty for stealing a loaf of bread could be the same as raising a rebellion, impalement. But Vlad's psychological warfare extended beyond the stake. He mastered the art of misinformation, deliberately allowing exaggerated tales of his cruelty to spread. When Saxon merchants spread rumors of his atrocities, he didn't silence them, he amplified their stories, knowing the more monstrous his reputation grew, the fewer would dare challenge him. In one infamous incident, he allegedly hosted a banquet for his own noblemen, then impaled the guests mid-meal, seating their twitching bodies at the table as a warning to survivors. Whether entirely true or embellished, the story served its purpose. It made defiance unthinkable. The brilliance of Vlad's terror lay in its economy. He didn't need vast armies to enforce his will. The specter of his cruelty did the work for him. When the Ottomans invaded, he didn't meet them head-on. Instead, he poisoned wells, burned crops, and left behind fields of impaled prisoners as welcome signs for advancing troops. By the time Mehmed II's forces reached Târgoviște, morale was already shattered. The Sultan, facing a landscape of 20,000 rotting corpses, realized the cost of subduing Wallachia would be paid not just in gold, but in the sanity of his men. Yet for all its effectiveness, Vlad's reign of fear had a fatal flaw. It left no room for loyalty. His subjects obeyed out of terror, not devotion, and when the Ottomans finally backed his brother Radu as a rival ruler, many Wallachians switched sides simply to escape the nightmare. Fear, Vlad proved, could sustain power, but only for as long as the specter of punishment loomed larger than the promise of rebellion. In the end, his greatest weapon became his undoing, a lesson etched not just in history, but in the very methods tyrants still emulate today. Vlad the Impaler's reign wasn't just defined by his wars with the Ottomans. Another group felt the full force of his wrath, the Saxon merchants of Transylvania. These wealthy German settlers controlled trade routes through Wallachia, amassing fortunes while often ignoring local laws and taxes. To Vlad, they weren't just outsiders, they were leeches draining his kingdom's wealth and propping up his political rivals. His retaliation would be as swift as it was savage. In 1457, rumors reached Vlad that Saxon leaders in Brasov were sheltering a rival claimant to his throne. This wasn't just political meddling, it was treason. His response was characteristically brutal. Under cover of darkness, his forces stormed the city's outskirts, torching homes, slaughtering resistance, and dragging hundreds of prisoners back to Wallachia. But Vlad didn't stop at mere punishment. he transformed the executions into a grotesque exhibition, impaling victims along the road to Târgoviște in a grisly parade of power. Among the dead were merchants, craftsmen, even children, a deliberate shock to the Saxon community's core. The economic motives were just as calculated. Saxon guilds had long monopolized trade, charging exorbitant tolls and funneling profits back to Transylvania while Wallachian peasants struggled. Vlad's raids shattered their dominance overnight. He seized Saxon goods, redistributed wealth to his treasury, and enforced strict new trade laws favoring local merchants, but his true masterstroke was psychological. By attacking Brasov, a symbol of Saxon prosperity, he sent a clear message: cross Wallachia, and no fortress, no wealth, no status would save you. Yet the Saxons weren't passive victims. They struck back with propaganda, circulating pamphlets across Europe depicting Vlad as a deranged butcher. These accounts, some wildly exaggerated, cemented his monstrous reputation in the West. But Vlad likely welcomed the horror they inspired. Fear, after all, was his currency. When Saxon merchants later begged for trade rights, they did so on their knees, offering concessions they'd never have considered before. The Saxon conflicts reveal a chilling truth about Vlad's rule. His brutality was never random. Whether impaling Ottomans or razing Saxon towns, every act served a dual purpose: crushing enemies and crafting a myth so terrifying it made resistance unthinkable. In the end, the forests of stakes weren't just punishments. They were the foundation of a reign built on the certainty that no one, not even the wealthiest or most powerful, was beyond his reach. Among the most enduring legends about Vlad the Impaler is the tale of the Golden Cup. It's said that to prove his dominion over crime, he placed a priceless golden goblet in the central square of Târgoviște, untouched by guards, free for anyone to take. Years passed and not a single hand dared to steal it. This story, repeated in pamphlets and chronicles across Europe, wasn't just a boast about order, it was a masterclass in myth-making. But how much of it was true? Historians suspect the cup itself might have been embellished, perhaps a simple drinking vessel exaggerated into treasure, but the underlying message was real. Vlad's reign did see a drastic drop in theft, not because his people were virtuous, but because the penalty, rumored or real, made disobedience unthinkable. Then there's the chilling account of the burning of the sick and poor. According to Saxon propagandists, Vlad once invited beggars and invalids to a grand feast, promising them shelter and care. Once they were inside, he boarded the doors and set the building ablaze, declaring he'd purged Wallachia of its useless mouths. But dig deeper and the story unravels. No contemporary Wallachian records mention the event, and the only sources are hostile foreign accounts with clear motives to vilify him. That's not to say Vlad shied from brutality. His impalements are well documented, but this particular atrocity reeks of political theater, a grotesque rumor designed to paint him as a monster beyond redemption. Perhaps the most famous and contested legend is that of the impaled Turkish envoys. When Ottoman diplomats refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing religious custom, Vlad reportedly had the headwear nailed to their skulls before impaling them. It's a scene straight from a horror story, but the truth may be more nuanced. Diplomatic records from the era confirmed tensions between Vlad and the Ottomans, and his defiance of their demands was real. Yet the turban's detail, while plausible given his flair for symbolic cruelty, might have been embellished to stoke anti-Ottoman sentiment in Christian Europe. After all, nothing rallied support like a ruler who turned the enemy's own arrogance against them. Folklore didn't just exaggerate Vlad's deeds, it invented entire episodes. One pamphlet claimed he dined among forests of impaled corpses, dipping bread in their blood. Another described him boiling victims alive or skinning them piece by piece. These tales spread like wildfire, copied and embellished with each retelling, often by Saxons seeking to justify their own campaigns against him. But the irony is thick. Many of these stories were crafted by the very merchants whose greed Vlad had challenged. Their pamphlets, printed on the newly invented Gutenberg press, became medieval Europe's first viral propaganda, shaping his image for centuries. Yet even the wildest myths held a kernel of strategic truth. Vlad may not have bathed in blood, but he understood the power of spectacle. By allowing, even encouraging, these stories to circulate, he turned his reputation into a weapon. Enemies didn't just fear the man, they feared the legend, a shadow so vast it could paralyze armies before a single sword was drawn. In the end, the line between fact and fiction mattered less than the result. Whether through stakes or stories, Vlad ensured his name would echo through history, not as a king, but as something far more enduring, a warning. Vlad the Impaler's reputation as a lone wolf of brutality obscures a far more nuanced truth. He was also a shrewd diplomat, playing a dangerous game of alliances across Europe's fractured political landscape. While his impalements grabbed headlines, his letters reveal a ruler desperately maneuvering to save his kingdom from Ottoman domination. Take his correspondence with Hungary's King Matthias Corvinus. At first glance, they were natural allies, both Christian rulers resisting Ottoman expansion. But Vlad's pleas for military support, preserved in archives, expose a fragile partnership built on mutual distrust. He wrote not as a supplicant but as a strategist, warning Matthias that Wallachia's fall would leave Hungary a feast for the Sultan's appetite. Yet these alliances were riddled with betrayals. In 1462, with Ottoman forces massing at his borders, Vlad secured a secret pact with Moldavia's Prince Stephen the Great, his own cousin. Together, they planned a coordinated strike against the Turks, but when Vlad launched his daring night attack, Stephen's forces never arrived, leaving Wallachia exposed. Was it logistical failure or cold political calculus? Some historians suggest Stephen hesitated, fearing retaliation against Moldavia. Others point to whispers that Hungarian factions, wary of Vlad's growing power, sabotaged the alliance. Either way, the episode reveals a harsh truth. In 15th-century diplomacy, even blood ties bowed to survival. Vlad's most revealing letters were penned not to allies but to distant powers like the Pope and Venice. His missives to Pope Pius II, begging for a crusade against the Ottomans, mixed pious rhetoric with stark realism. "We stand as Christendom's bulwark," he wrote, "yet fight with shadows at our backs." The Venetians, ever pragmatic, entertained his proposals only so far as their trade interests allowed. Their archived responses show polite interest and zero troops sent. What emerges from these documents isn't the caricature of a mindless butcher, but a ruler trapped in a geopolitical vise. Every alliance demanded compromises that chipped away at his autonomy. Hungary's support came with strings, accepting Catholic influence in Orthodox Wallachia. Moldavia's aid risked provoking Poland. Even his anti-Ottoman stance alienated factions who preferred paying tribute to risking war. In the end, Vlad's diplomacy failed not from lack of skill, but because Europe's powers saw Wallachia as expendable, a buffer state to bleed the Ottomans, not a partner to protect. His letters, yellowed with age, remain haunting testaments to a brutal truth. Sometimes no amount of cunning can outmaneuver the cold equations of power. Vlad the Impaler's final confrontation with the Ottomans should have been his crowning moment, a defiant stand that cemented his legacy. Instead, it became the prelude to his downfall. In the aftermath of his brutal night attack against Sultan Mehmed II's camp, Vlad expected reinforcements from Hungary's King Matthias Corvinus. What he got was betrayal. In 1462, as Wallachia reeled from Ottoman reprisals, Matthias invited Vlad to negotiate aid at the Hungarian court. It was a trap. Upon arrival, Vlad found himself seized, shackled, and accused of treason, charged with secretly conspiring with the Ottomans, the very enemy he'd spent years fighting. The evidence, a forged letter, allegedly from Vlad to Mehmed, pledging allegiance. It was a flimsy pretext, but Matthias had his reasons. The Hungarian king faced pressures of his own. While Vlad's brutal tactics had stalled the Ottoman advance, his extreme methods made him a liability. European allies, particularly the Pope, wanted a united Christian front against the Turks, not a rogue prince whose atrocities alienated potential supporters. Matthias, ever the politician, saw an opportunity. By imprisoning Vlad, he could appease both the Saxons, who hated Vlad for his raids, and the Ottomans, who demanded his head. But there's another layer to this betrayal. Some historians argue Matthias never intended to abandon Vlad permanently. Imprisonment might have been a temporary move, a way to sideline a volatile ally until the political winds shifted. Vlad's 12-year captivity was a far cry from the luxury of his Ottoman youth. Confined to the fortress of Visegrad, he was kept in relative comfort but stripped of power. His cell reportedly had books, even a writing desk, yet the isolation was its own torment. Outside, his brother Radu, now an Ottoman puppet, ruled Wallachia. Inside, Vlad watched as the kingdom he'd fought for crumbled under foreign influence. Ironically, his imprisonment softened his image. Hungarian courtiers, expecting a monster, found instead a charismatic, educated nobleman. Vlad played the part expertly, converting to Catholicism and even marrying Matthias's cousin, solidifying his place in Hungary's inner circle. But was Matthias's move purely political? Letters from the time reveal a deeper game. By holding Vlad in reserve, Hungary maintained a bargaining chip, a potential rival ruler to destabilize Ottoman-controlled Wallachia whenever convenient. Vlad's eventual release in 1475 wasn't mercy, it was cold strategy. With Radu dead and Wallachia in chaos, Matthias needed a proven warrior to reclaim the throne. The man he'd once jailed as a liability was now his last hope. The fall of Vlad the Impaler, then, wasn't just a tale of betrayal. It was a lesson in realpolitik, proof that in the chessboard of 15th century power, even the most fearsome pieces were expendable until they weren't. By 1476, Vlad the Impaler was a ghost of his former self, no longer the untouchable scourge of the Ottomans, but a pawn in Hungary's last gamble to reclaim Wallachia. Released from captivity after 12 years, he was handed a hastily assembled army, a grim recognition that even his enemies needed his brutality one final time. The kingdom he returned to was unrecognizable. Ottoman-backed rulers had bled Wallachia dry, and the people, weary of foreign puppets, whispered his name not with terror but with desperate hope. This was Vlad's last dance, a chance to prove his legend hadn't faded with his imprisonment, but the rules of the game had changed. His reinstatement was swift and bloody. With Hungarian support, he drove out the Ottoman-aligned ruler Basarab the Elder in a campaign that echoed his old ruthlessness. Villages that resisted were burned, traitors impaled. Yet something was different. The fire of his earlier reign had dimmed. Where once he'd orchestrated grand spectacles of terror, now his actions felt frantic, almost reckless. Historians debate whether age had softened him or if the years in captivity had eroded his strategic edge. What's undeniable is that his third reign lasted barely 2 months. By December 1476, the Ottomans struck back with overwhelming force, and Vlad's forces scattered. Then the mystery. Vlad's final moments are shrouded in contradiction. One account claims he fell in battle near Bucharest, ambushed by Ottoman troops as he rallied his men. Another suggests treachery, that his own boyars, fearing another cycle of purges, betrayed him to the enemy. The most tantalizing theory, that he was assassinated by Hungarian agents who'd always seen him as a temporary weapon, disposable once his usefulness ended. His body, if recovered, was treated with macabre symbolism. Some say his head was sent to Constantinople, displayed on a pike as proof the Impaler was finally dead. Others insist he was buried in secret, denied even the dignity of a marked grave. The location of his remains fuels speculation to this day. A monastery on Snagov Island, long linked to Vlad's family, claims to hold his bones, yet excavations found only animal remains beneath the supposed tomb. Another theory points to Komana Monastery, founded by Vlad himself, where a headless skeleton was discovered near the altar. but the truth may be simpler. In the chaos of his death, his enemies made certain no shrine would ever become a rallying point for his legacy. What's striking isn't just how Vlad died, but how quickly his legend outpaced the facts. Within years, Saxon pamphlets inflated his death into divine retribution, while Wallachian ballads recast him as a martyr. The Ottomans, eager to erase his defiance, downplayed his end as insignificant. Yet in that dissonance lies the essence of Vlad the Impaler, a figure so polarizing, even his death couldn't be confined to a single story. Whether he fell by sword, betrayal, or conspiracy, one thing's certain: the man who ruled through fear ultimately became the thing that outlived him, a myth too terrifying to bury, too useful to forget. Vlad the Impaler's personal life was as turbulent as his reign, a shadowed tapestry of alliances, betrayals, and survival woven through the very family he sought to protect. His first wife, whose name history has erased, met a tragic end during the Ottoman siege of Ponari Castle. As Vlad's forces battled maimed II's troops, she chose to leap from the castle's tower into the Arge's River rather than face capture, a moment immortalized in local folklore as the Lady's Plunge. But Vlad remarried, this time to Justina Szilágyi, a Hungarian noblewoman and cousin to King Matthias. Their union was less about love than politics, a fragile thread binding Wallachia to Hungary's interests. She bore him at least 2 sons, though their fates would diverge sharply from their father's infamy. One son, Mihnea, briefly ruled Wallachia in the early 16th century, earning the grim nickname Mihnea the Bad for his harsh policies, proof that cruelty ran in the blood. But the more fascinating legacy lies with Vlad's other son, often called Vlad the Younger. Unlike his father, he avoided confrontation with the Ottomans, opting for uneasy coexistence. His descendants, known as the Drăculești line, would quietly endure, intermarrying with noble families across Eastern Europe. Centuries later, branches of this bloodline surfaced in Romania's aristocracy, some even claiming distant ties to the British royal family through obscure marital connections. The Drăculești name may have faded from power, but its echoes lingered, a whisper of the Impaler's once unshakable grip on history. Then there was Radu, Vlad's younger brother and ultimate foil. Where Vlad resisted the Ottomans with unrelenting ferocity, Radu embraced their culture, earning the title Radu the Handsome for his charm and adaptability. After their shared captivity as boys, Radu became a favorite of Mehmed II, even serving as a commander in the Sultan's army. When Vlad was toppled in 1462, Radu took the Wallachian throne with Ottoman backing, a bitter irony given their shared trauma. His rule was marked by uneasy compromise, bending to Ottoman demands while avoiding his brother's brutality. Yet Radu's reign collapsed within years, his health failing amid rumors of poison or heartbreak. His death left Wallachia in chaos, a vacuum that would eventually draw Vlad back for his final, doomed campaign. The contrast between the brothers couldn't be starker. Vlad's legacy was carved in spikes and defiance, Radu's in whispered diplomacy and survival. One became a symbol of resistance, the other a cautionary tale of assimilation. But perhaps the most haunting thread is how their bloodline endured. Today, scattered descendants unknowingly carry fragments of their DNA, a living testament to the fact that even the darkest legacies refuse to die quietly. The Drăculești name may no longer command thrones, but its story is a reminder that history's currents flow not just through battles and borders, but through the unbroken chain of generations, each link whispering secrets of the past. Bram Stoker never set foot in Transylvania, never walked the corridors of Ponari Castle, yet when he penned Dracula in 1897, he tapped into something far older than fiction. The connection between Vlad the Impaler and literature's most infamous vampire wasn't accidental. Stoker, an Irish theatre manager with a fascination for the macabre, stumbled upon Vlad's name while researching Eastern European folklore. In a London library, he scribbled notes from a dusty tome that mentioned Voivode Dracula, a ruler who crossed the Danube and defeated the Turks. That brief reference ignited a creative spark, but the real Vlad and the fictional Count would soon blur in ways even Stoker couldn't have predicted. The parallels are uncanny. Stoker's Dracula is a Transylvanian nobleman, a warrior who fought against the Turk, mirroring Vlad's defiance of the Ottomans. Both wield terror as a weapon, one with stakes, the other with fangs. Even their titles echo, Dracula meaning son of the dragon or devil, a name Vlad inherited from his father. But Stoker didn't just borrow a name, he absorbed the aura of Vlad's legend, the impenetrable mountain fortresses, the whispers of unspeakable cruelty, the sense of a man who traded his humanity for power. The novel's opening chapters, where Dracula boasts of his lineage to Jonathan Harker, could have been lifted from Vlad's own letters. We Sheikleys have a right to be proud. What devil or witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood flows in these veins? Yet the differences are just as revealing. Vlad's atrocities were rooted in realpolitik, a brutal calculus of survival in a fractured world. Stoker's Dracula, by contrast, is pure Gothic fantasy, a seductive monster who defies mortality itself. The real Vlad impaled his enemies to deter invasions. The fictional Count drains blood to sustain his cursed existence. One was a mortal king whose cruelty had method, the other an immortal force of nature. Stoker took Vlad's historical reputation, already inflated by Saxon propaganda, and stretched it into myth, blending Wallachian history with Slavic vampire folklore. The irony, Vlad likely never drank a drop of blood in his life. The association with vampirism came later, fueled by superstitious whispers. Peasants in Transylvania, hearing tales of Vlad's impalements, began speculating that such cruelty must be supernatural. Bram Stoker seized this ambiguity, weaving fact and folklore into a tapestry far more enduring than history. Today, when we picture Dracula, the piercing eyes, the aristocratic menace, we're seeing Vlad's shadow refracted through centuries of fear and fascination. The man who weaponized terror in life became, in death, something even he couldn't have imagined, a legend that never dies. The stories that turned Vlad the Impaler into a legend weren't written by his supporters, they were crafted by his enemies, each stroke of the quill sharpened by political vendettas. Take the Saxon merchants of Transylvania, whose lucrative trade routes Vlad disrupted with his brutal taxes and raids. They didn't just resent him, they weaponized his reputation, commissioning pamphlets that depicted him as a deranged sadist feasting amid forests of impaled corpses. These weren't mere exaggerations, they were deliberate propaganda, printed on the newly invented Gutenberg press and distributed across Europe like wildfire. One particularly lurid illustration showed Vlad calmly dining beneath a canopy of dying victims, their blood dripping into his wine goblet. The message was clear. This wasn't just a ruler to fear, but a monster to rally against. But the Saxons weren't alone in spinning Vlad's myth. Ottoman chroniclers, too, had reasons to amplify his savagery. For Mehmed II, Vlad's defiance was an embarrassment, a minor prince humiliating the most powerful empire on earth. So Ottoman scribes recast their military setbacks as battles against supernatural evil, describing Vlad as a demon who drank the tears of his enemies. Their accounts conveniently omitted the Sultan's own retreat from Târgoviște, focusing instead on Vlad's impalements, which they framed as crimes against divine order. By painting him as an inhuman fiend, the Ottomans justified their brutality in response, turning a geopolitical struggle into a holy war. The printing press became the ultimate accomplice in this smear campaign. Unlike handwritten manuscripts, which circulated slowly among elites, printed pamphlets reached masses quickly and cheaply. A single Saxon broadsheet from 1463, the story of a bloodthirsty madman, was reprinted over 30 times, each copy more embellished than the last. Vlad's real atrocities, harsh but strategically calculated, were drowned in a sea of invented horrors. boiling children, skinning ambassadors alive, even impaling animals for sport. The more outlandish the tale, the faster it spread, cementing his image as a figure of nightmare long after his death. Yet the greatest irony lies in how Vlad himself may have encouraged the hype. He understood that fear traveled faster than armies, and these grotesque rumors, though false, served his goals. When enemies hesitated to attack, fearing the worst, the propaganda became a self-fulfilling prophecy. In the end, the line between Vlad the man and Vlad the myth wasn't just blurred by his adversaries, it was a shadow he learned to wield, proving that in the medieval world, reputation could be deadlier than any sword. High atop a sheer cliff in the Carpathian Mountains, the crumbling walls of Ponari Castle still whisper tales of Vlad the Impaler's defiance. This wasn't just a fortress, it was a statement. Perched like an eagle's nest, accessible only by climbing 1,400 vertigo-inducing steps, it served as both his stronghold and a symbol of unbreakable will. Archaeologists examining the site have uncovered charred beams and arrowheads embedded in stone, remnants of the Ottoman siege where Vlad's first wife allegedly leaped to her death. The castle's strategic design reveals his tactical genius. Sheer drop-offs on three sides, a single narrow entrance and hidden tunnels for escapes, but perhaps the most chilling discovery. A secret chamber beneath the courtyard, its walls scorched, where some believe Vlad interrogated prisoners before their grim fate. Then there's Snagov Monastery, nestled on an island in a mist-shrouded lake. Local lore claims this was Vlad's chosen burial site, and in 1933, archaeologists uncovered a headless skeleton near the altar, draped in faded silk embroidered with dragon motifs, the symbol of his father's order. But the story twists here. Forensic analysis suggested the bones dated centuries earlier, and the tomb was suspiciously empty except for a few animal remains. Was this a decoy to fool grave robbers, a deliberate act of disrespect by his enemies, or proof that Vlad's body, like his legend, refused to be pinned down? The hunt for artifacts tied to Vlad reads like an Indiana Jones script. In 2014, researchers in Turkey claimed to unearth his lost dungeon beneath Tokat Castle, where he was allegedly held as a hostage. The dark, airless chamber bore scratches on the walls, crude dragon symbols that might have been carved by a young prince clinging to identity. Yet skeptics point out the lack of direct evidence linking these marks to Vlad. Even his signature, preserved on a handful of letters, fuels debate. Paleographers note its jagged, aggressive strokes, starkly different from the flowing script of his contemporaries. Was this the hand of a man perpetually braced for war? Then there's the infamous Dracula's dagger, displayed in a Romanian museum. The ornate weapon, etched with Cyrillic inscriptions, was said to have been used for impalements. But radiocarbon dating revealed it was crafted decades after Vlad's death. Such controversies underscore a deeper truth. Every relic tied to him becomes a mirror, reflecting what we want to believe about power, about cruelty, about the thin line between history and myth. The real archaeological treasure isn't bones or blades, but the enduring mystery of a man who mastered fear so completely, even his empty grave still holds the world captive. In the villages of Wallachia, where history blends with fireside tales, Vlad the Impaler takes on a strikingly different guise from the monster of Western legends. Here, he's remembered not just as a tyrant, but as a stern ruler who brought order to a lawless land. One folktale recounts how he once placed a golden chalice by a well, daring thieves to take it, a test the people passed thanks to his iron-fisted justice. Another tells of corrupt boyars who stole from peasants, only to find themselves dangling from the very stakes they'd helped erect. These stories, passed down through generations, paint a man who was brutal, yes, but with a twisted sense of fairness, a ruler who punished the wicked, no matter their status. This folkloric Vlad stands in stark contrast to the blood-drinking demon of Saxon pamphlets, where Western accounts exaggerated his cruelty for political gain. Romanian oral traditions often frame his violence as necessity. Take the legend of the lazy monk. It's said Vlad visited a monastery where the clergy lived in luxury while the poor starved. Enraged, he burned the monastery to the ground, sparing only one industrious monk who'd secretly fed the hungry. Such tales reveal a cultural nuance. To Wallachians, Vlad wasn't a mindless butcher, but a scourge of corruption, a man who used terror as a scalpel, not a club. Even his impalements take on new meaning in local lore. A ballad from the Transylvanian highlands describes him impaling a group of thieves, but with a chilling twist. Each stake was carved with the crime committed, turning the execution site into a grotesque ledger of justice. Another story claims he once spared a condemned man who'd shown courage, offering him a role in his army instead. These narratives don't whitewash his brutality, but they contextualize it, suggesting a ruler who believed cruelty could be a tool for stability. The divide between these portrayals isn't just about perspective, it's about survival. For Saxon merchants and Ottoman propagandists, vilifying Vlad served political ends. But for Wallachian peasants living under constant threat of invasion and noble exploitation, his harshness may have felt like a grim necessity. Folktales often mention his raids on wealthy Saxon traders, framing them not as random atrocities, but as retaliation for hoarding grain during famines. In one village, elders still speak of how he disguised himself as a beggar to expose greedy innkeepers who cheated travelers, a medieval Robin Hood with a taste for steaks. Yet even in Romania, the legend isn't monolithic. Some regions remember him with ambivalence, like the Moldavian tale of the Weeping Impaler. It tells of Vlad standing alone at night by a forest of corpses, whispering, "I do this so others may sleep safely." Whether rooted in fact or fiction, these stories reveal a truth more complex than any pamphlet, that the line between hero and monster often depends on who's holding the pen or passing down the story. The real Vlad may be lost to time, but in the whispers of Carpathian winds and the embers of peasant fires, he remains a man of contradictions, his legacy as dual-edged as the swords he wielded. Few historical figures have been reinvented as dramatically as Vlad the Impaler, especially in his homeland. In modern Romania, his legacy isn't just debated, it's been weaponized, softened, and polished to suit the politics of the moment. Take the communist era, when Nicolae Ceausescu's regime recast Vlad as a national hero, a symbol of resistance against foreign domination. Textbooks glossed over his brutality, focusing instead on his battles against the Ottomans, framing him as a proto-patriot defending Romanian sovereignty. State-sponsored murals depicted him not with stakes, but with a sword raised high, a defiant guardian of the nation. This wasn't history, it was propaganda, tailor-made to rally a nation under Soviet shadow. The fall of communism in 1989 didn't bury Vlad's symbolic power, it unleashed new interpretations. Today, his image is splintered. In some corners, he's a folk hero, his face emblazoned on beer bottles and football jerseys. In others, a cautionary tale about the cost of unchecked power. The town of Târgoviște, where he once ruled, boasts a haunting statue not of Vlad the Impaler, but Vlad the statesman, seated contemplatively, a far cry from the blood-drenched tyrant of Western lore. Meanwhile, debates rage in academic circles. Should Romania celebrate a figure whose methods mirrored the cruelty of 20th-century dictators? Cultural references weave him into the fabric of modern identity. A popular TV series, Descendants of the Dragon, dramatizes his life with a nationalist twist, while heavy metal bands like Negura Bunget invoke his name in lyrics as a metaphor for resilience. Even tourism leans into the myth. Bran Castle, often marketed as Dracula's castle, despite having no real connection to Vlad, draws thousands, capitalizing on the blurred line between history and Hollywood. Yet beneath the spectacle lies a raw question. How does a nation reconcile with a past that's equal parts pride and horror? For some Romanians, Vlad embodies the unyielding spirit needed to survive centuries of invasion. For others, he's a reminder that defiance can curdle into tyranny. His statues aren't just stone and metal, they're mirrors, reflecting a country still wrestling with what it means to remember and who gets to decide. What kind of mind could orchestrate such calculated horror? Historians and psychologists have agonized over Vlad the Impaler's psyche for centuries, dissecting his actions like a macabre puzzle. The boy who entered Ottoman captivity at 12 wasn't yet a monster, but the man who emerged bore scars deeper than any battlefield wound. Modern clinicians might recognize the symptoms: night terrors, hypervigilance, explosive rage, all hallmarks of post-traumatic stress forged in the crucible of his youth. Imagine the constant fear of execution, the humiliation of being a political pawn, the betrayal of watching his brother Radu thrive while he seethed. Some scholars argue these experiences didn't just harden Vlad, they rewired him, turning survival instincts into something far darker. Yet trauma alone can't explain the sheer theatricality of his cruelty. This was a man who allegedly dined among impaled corpses, who staged mass executions with the precision of a director. Psychopathy whispers through these details, a chilling lack of empathy, a gift for manipulation, the ability to weaponize fear with cold precision. Dr. Adrian Rain, a neurocriminologist, notes how childhood trauma can erode moral boundaries, especially in those predisposed to antisocial traits. Vlad's upbringing checks every box: violence modeled by his father, early exposure to political murder, years in an environment where mercy equaled weakness. But historians push back against armchair diagnoses. Professor Radu Floresu, who spent decades studying Wallachian archives, argues Vlad's brutality was strategic, not pathological. This wasn't madness, he insists, it was medieval realpolitik. In an era where rulers routinely tortured enemies, Vlad simply perfected the art. His impalements weren't random. They targeted specific groups: corrupt boyars, Ottoman soldiers, Saxon traders. Even his infamous Golden Cup legend served a purpose, proving order could flourish under absolute terror. The debate grows murkier when examining his personal writings. In letters to Hungarian allies, Vlad displays startling clarity, even charm. He quotes scripture, appeals to shared Christian identity, and laments Wallachia's suffering, hardly the ramblings of a deranged mind. Yet other missives reveal paranoid fixations, like his conviction that Matthias Corvinus would betray him, a prophecy that proved tragically correct. This duality fuels the central question: was he a shattered survivor lashing out, or a master tactician who understood fear's power better than anyone? Perhaps the truth lies in the gray spaces between labels. Vlad's world demanded brutality to survive, but his excesses suggest something beyond pragmatism. The boy who watched his father's severed head paraded by enemies learned one indelible lesson: in a kingdom of wolves, only the most monstrous could reign. Whether that made him a product of his time or a warning for all time depends on who holds the scalpel: the historian, the psychologist, or the trembling peasant remembering the shadow of the stakes. Vlad the Impaler didn't just fight armies, he dismantled them psychologically, rewriting the rules of medieval warfare with strategies so ruthless they're studied to this day. Facing the Ottoman Empire's vast forces, he turned Wallachia's landscape into a weapon, mastering asymmetrical combat centuries before the term existed. His signature scorched earth tactics weren't mere destruction, they were precision strikes. When Mehmed II's troops crossed the Danube, they found villages reduced to ashes, wells poisoned with carcasses, and fields smoldering. No crops to forage, no clean water to drink, just miles of barren ground, forcing the Ottomans to stretch supply lines to the breaking point. This wasn't mindless brutality, it was a calculated gamble. Vlad knew Wallachia couldn't win pitched battles against the Sultan's artillery and janissaries, so he made the land itself rebel against the invaders. His night raids redefined medieval combat. While most commanders of his era avoided fighting after dark, deeming it dishonorable or logistically impossible. Vlad weaponized the shadows. Ottoman chronicles describe attacks where his cavalry, draped in black cloth to muffle hoofbeats, would materialize like specters in their camps, slashing tent ropes and sowing chaos before vanishing. The psychological toll was devastating. Sleep-deprived troops began seeing enemies in every rustle of the wind, their morale crumbling faster than their ranks. Compare this to the rigid, daylight battles favored by contemporaries like Hungary's Matthias Corvinus, who clung to chivalric codes even as Vlad rewrote the playbook. Terrain was another chess piece in his deadly game. He funneled Ottoman troops into narrow mountain passes where their numerical advantage meant nothing, then rained down boulders and fire from above. At the Battle of the Night attack, he exploited fog and forest to mask his movements, turning Mehmed's own camp into a slaughterhouse. This wasn't just tactics, it was theater. Like the Mongols before him, Vlad understood that defeating an army wasn't enough. You had to shatter its will to fight again. Yet what truly set him apart was his fusion of psychological and military warfare. Other warlords of the era, France's Charles the Bold or England's Edward IV, won battles through discipline or technology. Vlad won by making his enemies believe he wasn't just a man but an elemental force. When his impaled forests greeted the Ottomans at Târgoviște, it wasn't merely a war crime, it was a masterstroke of demoralization. The Sultan's elite troops, veterans of countless campaigns, reportedly retched at the sight. In that moment, Vlad proved a timeless truth. Sometimes the most potent weapon isn't a sword or a cannon, but the unbearable weight of dread. Vlad the Impaler's economic policies were as ruthless as his battle tactics, but beneath the brutality lay a calculated effort to rescue Wallachia from financial collapse. When he seized the throne in 1456, the kingdom was bleeding. Wealth-corrupt boyars hoarded gold while peasants starved, and foreign merchants, particularly Saxon traders, exploited trade routes with impunity. Vlad's solution wasn't gentle reform, it was a merciless overhaul. He slashed the boyars' power by confiscating their estates, redistributing land to loyal soldiers and starving villages. Overnight, the feudal system that had enriched a select few began to crumble, replaced by a grim meritocracy where loyalty was rewarded and betrayal punished with a stake. Trade became a battleground. The Saxons, who controlled lucrative routes through Transylvania, had long treated Wallachia as a toll booth, imposing exorbitant fees on goods like salt, wine, and wool. Vlad's response, a mix of drastic tariffs and outright bans. He barred Saxon merchants from key markets, favoring local producers instead. When traders flouted these rules, the consequences were ghastly impaled bodies lining commercial roads as warnings. Yet the brutality worked. Contemporary accounts note an eerie shift. For the first time, Wallachian craftsmen could sell their goods without undercutting by foreign cartels. One Moldavian chronicler wrote of seeing Wallachian markets bustling with local wares, their prices now untouched by Saxon greed. Corruption met an even fiercer fate. Vlad's reign saw a crackdown so severe it bordered on theatrical. Officials caught embezzling taxes weren't just executed, they were impaled outside their own offices, their families forced to repay stolen sums or face slavery. Anecdotes survive of tax collectors so terrified they returned extorted coins voluntarily, begging for mercy. The irony, crime rates plummeted. Even hostile sources like the Saxon priest Michael Beheim admitted that under Vlad, a purse of gold might lie 3 days in the street untouched. But the most revealing policy was his currency reform. Wallachia's coins had been debased for years, their silver content dwindling to line noble pockets. Vlad recalled the corrupted currency, minting new coins stamped with his crest, a dragon, echoing his father's legacy. These weren't just economic tools, they were propaganda. Every transaction declared his authority, a daily reminder that the man who controlled the money controlled the kingdom. Yet for all their brutality, these policies stabilized a realm teetering on ruin. Peasants, long crushed under feudal abuses, found respite in predictable taxes and protected markets. The treasury, once drained by graft, swelled with confiscated wealth. Even his enemies couldn't ignore the results, a Wallachia that functioned, however grimly. Vlad's economics weren't about prosperity, they were about survival, proving that in a world of wolves, sometimes the only way to guard the flock was to become the most terrifying predator of all. Vlad the Impaler's relationship with faith was as contradictory as the man himself, a devout Orthodox Christian who built monasteries with one hand and impaled priests with the other. His piety wasn't performative. Records show he donated generously to Snagov and Komana monasteries, even funding the restoration of churches razed by Ottoman armies. A surviving letter to the Hungarian king justifies his raids on Saxon towns as divine retribution, quoting Psalm 58, "The righteous shall rejoice when he seeth the vengeance." Here was a ruler who saw himself not as a butcher, but as God's scourge, a defender of Christendom waging holy war against Muslim invaders and corrupt Christians alike. Yet his brutality toward clergy reveals a darker calculus. When Wallachian bishops conspired with rival boyars, Vlad had them impaled alongside nobles, their vestments no shield from his wrath. In one notorious incident, he allegedly executed a monk for refusing to grant absolution to condemned prisoners, declaring, "If you won't send them to heaven, I'll send you to judge them firsthand." These weren't acts of atheism, but of terrifying consistency, a belief that even men of God were subject to his iron justice. The paradox deepens when examining his patronage. At Târgoviște's princely court church, frescoes depicted saints with Vlad's piercing eyes, as if sanctifying his rule. He enforced strict observance of orthodox rites, punishing blasphemy as harshly as treason. But this was religion weaponized, a tool to unify his people against external threats while justifying internal purges. Compare this to Western rulers like Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella, who used Catholicism to legitimize the Inquisition. Vlad's faith wasn't hypocrisy, it was the medieval mind's ability to compartmentalize, to kneel at dawn prayers and order impalements by noon, seeing no contradiction. Perhaps the most revealing artifact is his prayer book, discovered in a Moldavian monastery. Its margin notes, scrawled in his jagged hand, alternate between pleas for divine guidance and lists of enemies to punish. On one page, a prayer for mercy, on the next, a sketch of a stake. This was the essence of Vlad's religion, a faith that exalted justice over mercy, where the cross and the stake weren't opposites, but twin instruments of a ruler who believed heaven smiled upon his terror. From the flickering shadows of silent cinema to the neon glow of modern gaming consoles, Vlad the Impaler has been resurrected countless times as Dracula, an immortal symbol of terror. The first major distortion came in 1922 with F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, an unauthorized adaptation of Stoker's novel that transformed Vlad into Count Orlok, a rodent-like creature spreading plague. Gone was the aristocratic charisma, in its place a grotesque monster reflecting post-war Germany's anxieties. Yet this was just the beginning. When Bela Lugosi donned the cape in 1931's Dracula, he cemented the image of a suave, hypnotic nobleman, a far cry from the Wallachian warlord who dined among steaks. Hollywood's version traded historical grit for Gothic romance, spinning a tale of doomed love rather than medieval brutality. Video games took the myth in wild new directions. The Castlevania series reimagined Dracula as a recurring demonic force, his castle a labyrinth of horror. While superficially fantasy, these games preserved Vlad's strategic genius, his traps mirroring the real Impaler's psychological warfare. Even Assassin's Creed, known for historical accuracy, portrayed Vlad briefly in Revelations as a blood-drenched madman, reducing his complex feud with Mame II to a berserker rampage. These portrayals prioritize spectacle over nuance, yet they inadvertently echo an essential truth. Vlad understood fear as a weapon long before developers coded it into boss battles. Historical dramas struggle most with his duality. The Romanian film Vlad the Impaler, 1979, leans into nationalist pride, showcasing his battles while softening his atrocities. In contrast, the Turkish series Rise of Empires, Ottoman frames him as a ruthless obstacle to Mehmed's grandeur, a narrative shaped by centuries of Ottoman vilification. The BBC's Dracula 2020 even attempted a meta-twist, revealing the Count's backstory as a tortured crusader, blending Stoker's fiction with fragments of Vlad's trauma. Books stretch the spectrum further. Elizabeth Kostova's The Historian weaves Vlad's legacy into a scholarly mystery, treating him as an unsolvable riddle. Meanwhile, comics like Helsing turn him into a supernatural antihero, bullets and stakes bouncing off his regenerating flesh. Each reimagining reflects the era's fears. The AIDS crisis birthed vampirism as contagion metaphor, while postmodern takes explore his psyche through therapy sessions or courtroom dramas. What unites these versions isn't fidelity to history, but the irresistible pull of his paradox, a man who defended Christendom with methods so demonic, he became the monster he fought. Whether as a tragic antihero or a soulless predator, Vlad the Impaler endures because his story isn't just about the past, it's a mirror, reflecting our own darkest fascinations back at us. Even centuries after his death, Vlad the Impaler refuses to surrender to history's grasp. The circumstances surrounding his final moments are shrouded in contradictions, each account more enigmatic than the last. Some chronicles claim he fell in battle against the Ottomans near Bucharest in 1476, his body hacked apart by enemy soldiers, but whispers persist that the corpse displayed by the Turks wasn't his at all, that he'd arranged a decoy, slipping away to plan one last resurgence. A Moldavian folktale tells of a hooded figure seen boarding a Genos ship on the Black Sea, while Ottoman spies later reported sightings of a man matching Vlad's description in Albania, gathering mercenaries. Could the man who mastered deception have staged his own demise? Without a confirmed grave, just empty tombs and disputed bones, the question lingers like fog over the Carpathians. Then there's the chilling rumor of his religious allegiance. During his imprisonment in Hungary, Vlad allegedly converted to Catholicism to curry favor with King Matthias. But a cryptic letter from an Ottoman defector in 1474 claims he'd secretly embraced Islam during his youth as a hostage, even praying toward Mecca in private. If true, it would rewrite everything we know about his crusade against the Turks. Was his war against Mehmed not a holy struggle, but a personal vendetta disguised as faith? The only surviving artifact that fuels this theory is a single page from an Ottoman ledger, listing a Wallachian prince among converts rewarded with land. But the name is smudged, the truth deliberately obscured, and what of his fabled treasure? Legends speak of gold looted from Saxon merchants and Ottoman caravans, hidden in tunnels beneath Ponari Castle or sunk in the depths of Lake Snagov. In 1931, archaeologist Dinu Rosti uncovered a sealed chamber near Târgoviște's ruins, empty except for a handful of silver coins and a note in Cyrillic. The dragon's hoard flies on. More recently, radar scans near Comana Monastery revealed unnatural voids underground, but excavations were halted due to political pressure. Whether myth or reality, the obsession with Vlad's lost wealth endures, a testament to the allure of a man who understood that riches, like terror, hold power long after death. The greatest mystery, though, isn't where he died or what he believed, it's why his shadow still looms so large. Unlike other medieval tyrants whose infamy faded with their dynasties, Vlad transcends time, morphing from historical figure to mythic archetype. Perhaps it's because his life resists easy categorization. He was a defender who became a monster, a Christian who may have bartered his soul, a ruler whose methods were unspeakable yet undeniably effective. In the end, the unanswered questions aren't gaps in his story, they're the very things that keep it alive. every generation molds Vlad to its fears, its fantasies, proving that the real impalement wasn't of bodies, but of our imagination, forever pinned between horror and fascination. Vlad the Impaler's shadow stretched far beyond the blood-soaked soil of Wallachia, shaping the course of empires and igniting fears that still flicker in modern imagination. His relentless resistance against the Ottomans didn't just stall their advance, it rewrote the playbook for how smaller nations could defy superpowers. The Sultan's retreat from Târgoviște sent shockwaves through Constantinople, forcing Mehmed II to rethink his European campaigns. Venetian diplomats spying an opportunity whispered of Vlad's tactics in courts from Rome to Vienna, turning his brutal success into a rallying cry for Christian resistance. Even the Pope Pius II cited Vlad's defiance in sermons, urging crusaders to emulate his righteous fury. Yet this very notoriety became a double-edged sword. While European powers praised his results, they distanced themselves from his methods, using him as both inspiration and cautionary tale. A man who proved empires could bleed, but at a cost too grotesque to embrace. Beyond battlefields, Vlad's legacy seeped into the fabric of global culture, morphing with each retelling. The Saxon merchants who first vilified him couldn't have imagined their pamphlets would seed a mythos spanning continents. By the 18th century, Transylvanian folklore had entwined his atrocities with ancient vampire legends, painting him as a restless revenant thirsting for blood. Bram Stoker's Dracula catapulted this fusion into modernity, but the real twist lies in how Vlad's historical narrative was hijacked by the very terror tactics he pioneered. The Ottomans, Saxons, and Hungarians had weaponized his reputation. Now, fiction completed the transformation, turning a medieval warlord into an immortal metaphor for unchecked power. Today, his influence lingers in unexpected corners. Military academies dissect his asymmetrical warfare, while psychologists analyze his use of fear as a governance tool. Romanian nationalists and EU politicians alike invoke his name, debating whether he was a patriot or a tyrant, proof that Vlad's true impalement wasn't of bodies, but of ideology, pinning societies between admiration and revulsion. Even pop culture can't escape his grip. From shadowy boardroom villains to dystopian dictators, the archetype of the ruthless strategist who rules through dread bears his fingerprint. The man who once boasted, "I have no need of crowns, only fear," might smirk at the irony. Centuries later, his crown is gone, but the fear endures, a dark mirror reflecting humanity's eternal dance with power and its price. Vlad the Impaler's legacy is a paradox carved in blood and bronze, a man celebrated as a national icon in one breath, condemned as a monster in the next. Walk the streets of Romania today, and you'll find his likeness on everything from statues to souvenir mugs, a symbol of unyielding resistance against foreign domination. Yet whisper his name elsewhere, and it conjures images of unspeakable cruelty, a byword for brutality that transcends centuries. This duality is the heart of his enduring fascination. Was he a patriot who used terror as a last resort, or a tyrant who reveled in suffering? The answer depends on who holds the pen and which pages of history they choose to turn. For Romanians, Vlad's defiance of the Ottomans resonates deeply, a narrative of survival against impossible odds. School textbooks frame him as a complex figure, flawed, yes, but necessary in a time when weakness meant annihilation. His draconian justice, however grotesque, forged a fleeting stability in a fractured land. Compare this to Western portrayals, where he's often reduced to a one-dimensional villain, his political cunning drowned out by tales of impaled corpses. Even Bram Stoker's Dracula, while borrowing his name, stripped away the context, leaving only the shell of a monster. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows between these extremes. What makes Vlad's story so compelling isn't just the violence, it's the uncomfortable questions he forces us to confront. How far is too far when defending your people? Can cruelty ever be justified as strategy? His life was a relentless calculus of ends and means, where every atrocity served a purpose, yet left scars that never fully healed. Modern parallels aren't hard to find. Leaders who suspend morality in the name of security, nations that trade freedom for fear. Vlad's reign becomes a dark mirror, reflecting tensions we still grapple with today. Perhaps the most telling testament to his legacy is how effortlessly he shapeshifts across cultures. In Turkey, he's a cautionary tale of Ottoman resilience. In Hungary, a warning about the cost of ruthlessness. Hollywood turned him into a seductive vampire, while political theorists dissect his tactics in essays on asymmetric warfare. This chameleon quality speaks to something deeper. His story isn't just history, but a Rorschach test for our own values and fears. So where does that leave us? Vlad the Impaler defies easy categorization, and maybe that's the point. His life invites us to sit with discomfort, to resist the urge to label him hero or villain. If you've made it this far, you've seen the man behind the myth, the hostage, the strategist, the scourge, the symbol. Now it's your turn. Dive deeper into the archives, debate his choices, question the sources. History isn't a verdict, it's a conversation, and in the comments below, that conversation continues. Was Vlad a necessary evil, a warning, or something far more human, a product of his time, as flawed and fascinating as the rest of us? The stakes, as always, are yours to decide.